Morning. Grab your Bibles with me and turn to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2. As you turn there, those of you who are fairly observant will note that Genesis is not 1 Peter. And for those of you who have not yet made that observation, I will observe it for you. Genesis is not 1 Peter. But we're still teaching through 1 Peter, but those of you who read ahead because you study ahead so that way when the word is preached, it's not your first time hearing it, noticed that Peter in chapter 3 turns his attention to wives and to husbands. And so, in other words, he brings the gospel to bear on marriage. And that's because the gospel wants to come to bear on every area of our lives, including marriage. And it's been 7-ish, longer than that, years since I from the pulpit talked anything about marriage, and because of that, I didn't want to just jump into 1 Peter 3 without letting the Bible give us some context around marriage. And so what I want to do is actually set marriage up from Genesis, because that, of course, was in Peter's mind as he's writing. I want to set marriage up from Genesis and let some context bear some weight before we jump back into 1 Peter. Now, some of you are like, I'm single and now I'm leaving. And I would prefer you not leave because of the fact that even though we need to look at marriage, there are still significant implications and application even for singles in this room. And so it's really important that you stay and you listen. You're a vital part of the church, married or not. But obviously marriage is a big part of healthy churches and healthy cultures. And the gospel, as I said, means to invade our marriages and needs to. And so therefore, we'll submit ourselves to God and to His Word. Now, before I jump into the text of the morning, let me make you aware of the fact that we are early on in Genesis. Again, those of you trending, more observant have noticed that, but we're early on. So there's not a ton of ground to cover to get you caught up. Basically, God made the world out of nothing, and He made it good. Good, 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 good. It just repeats itself as everything that God made is good. And then God comes to the pinnacle of His creation, which is man or mankind. And God says, let us make man in our own image, after our own likeness. That's Genesis 1:26. And let them, man and woman, humanity, have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the heavens, the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him. Male and female, He created them. Now, so God has made the world, and it's good, 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 good. God puts Adam in the garden as an image bearer, and God gives Adam a mandate, a call, a job, work the ground, keep the garden. And as Adam is doing that, God notices, verse 18 of now Genesis 2, God notices that it is not good. Now that not good should go off like a thunderclap in your brain, because everything to this point has been good, 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 good. Now it's not good. Something is not good. And the thing that God decides is not good is that the man should be alone, that Adam should be alone. So God says, I'll make a helper fit for him. Now out of the ground, the Lord God had formed every beast of the field, every bird of the heavens, and brought them to the man to see what he would call them. This is in alignment with Adam's dominion and with his job and responsibility, is that God parades the animals, it seems in pairs, in front of Adam, and He names all of them. And it's in the process of Adam doing this, verse 20, that as he's naming all the animals, it dawns on him that there was not found a helper fit for him. So he's looking at the pairs of animals. He's like, there's 2 of them, I'll name them that. There's 2 of them, I'll name them that. There's 2 of them, I'll name them that. And we don't know how long it took, because Adam did not yet have a wife to help him conclude this, so we don't know how long it took for him to conclude, there's 2 of all of them and 1 of me. And so for however long that took, but then Adam's like, I'm alone, and none of them are alone, but I'm alone. So God comes to Adam, verse 21, and says, son, take a nap. And while God's son Adam takes a nap, God grabs one of his ribs, closes up the place in his side, takes the rib, verse 22, that he had taken out of the man, and God makes the rib into a woman and now brought her to the man. So if you recall, God had brought all the animals to the man, and he's naming all of them in pairs. And now, in the first wedding ceremony that there ever was, God wakes Adam up and walks Eve down the aisle. Now, Adam hasn't named her Eve yet. He'll do that later. But God walks his daughter, Eve, down the aisle to the man. And the man said, this is the first recorded words from a human in all of creation, and it's Adam breaking out in a love song / poem for his wife. This at last, in other words, I've been waiting. This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she was taken out of man. Finally, I'm not alone anymore. And then Moses, after looking at this event go down, gives us a definition of marriage where he pauses a moment and makes a comment. Therefore, since all that's true, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. 3 observations about marriage. First, it's a gift from God. Second, it's designed by God. And third, marriage is defined by God. We turn our attention to the first observation. Marriage is a gift from God. You'll notice in verse 18, God is taking the initiative. God notices it's not good for the man to be alone, so God takes the initiative in making a helper fit for the man. God then puts his son to sleep, takes the rib, makes the woman, walks her down the aisle to the man, and it would be impossible to otherwise conclude anything other than that marriage is a gift from God. God's idea, God's initiative. Marriage is a gift from God. Now, some of you, if we're just going to be honest, are like, Alex, I get that marriage is a gift from God, but you haven't seen my spouse. Glad you brought that up, because maybe I have or maybe I haven't seen your spouse, but it's worth noting when Jesus talks to the religious leaders of the day about marriage and about actually the cultural wind that had perverted the covenant of marriage and turned into you can divorce your wife for any reason you want, which is what it was in Jesus' day. Jesus goes back to the original creation design for marriage, and he quotes from Genesis 2, and then he adds, they are no longer two but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man tear apart. And so actually, not only is marriage a gift from God, but so is your spouse a gift from God. Now here's the truth, because this happens. It gets a little awkward after it happens if I see you in Dunham's, but it does happen. Where sometimes somebody will come and they'll say, Pastor Alex, I'd like to get married. And I'm like, great, I'm pro-marriage. Let's meet up and talk. So we meet up and talk. And after sometimes not very long or sometimes a while, I have to say to the couple that wants me to marry them, I can't do this. You guys are absolutely, this isn't going to work. You've got way too many issues. You got way too, this isn't working. Now, if you want to work through your issues, then we can make this happen and it'll be really beautiful. If you don't work through your issues, this is going to be really bad. Most of the time, although there have been exceptions to this, but most of the time, people will say, fine, we'll just go find somebody else to do it. And that's exactly what happens. The point that I'm making is that it is possible that humanly speaking, if I had talked to you before your wedding, I'd have been like, this is not going to end well, don't do it. But once she walks the aisle and once you take the vows, and if you recall the vows that are like, till death parts us or Jesus comes, once that happens, once there's a ring, guess what? It's God's will that you're married to the spouse you're married to. Whether you like them or not is irrelevant. They're a gift. Marriage is a gift, and the spouse is a gift from God. God put you together. And so now you figure it out. But that's actually the original design. Marriage is a gift from God. Now, if you're not aware of this, I need to make you aware of it. The human condition is to worship and elevate the gift over the giver. That's the human condition. Don't worship the gift over the giver. Or said another way, don't gaze at the gift more than at the giver. The implications here are significant. I'll say a word to singles first. If you are single, you are not called to stare at the idea of marriage or stare at the idea of a future spouse. Or if you're dating, to stare at your dating or engaged, to stare at your future spouse. Rather, you stare at God. Don't make an idol out of the gift. Worship the giver. Don't gaze at the gift, gaze at the giver. And honestly, I was a single youth pastor for 2 years. And the church was so unhelpful in this area for me. I think well-meaning, but I remember one time I'm at Culver's, and there's a guy from my church is with me, and he is trying to convince me to marry the cashier. And I wanted to kill him because first of all, I was super embarrassed. That's one. Two, this idea or this notion that I don't think this guy was meaning to do, but just projecting anyway, is like, you're JV unless you're married. And like, I wanted to be married. But this notion, like, Jesus was never married and never had sex and was completely fulfilled as a man. So if you're single and you have the gift of singleness, meaning that you don't have a desire for marriage and you're content where you are, praise God, the church needs you. And if you are single and desire to be married, you are desiring a good thing, but don't stare at the good thing more than you stare at the giver. In other words, don't worship the creation over the creator. Don't elevate the gift over the giver. And it's really easy. If you have a good marriage, it can be really easy to focus and gaze at your spouse. And it's equally easy if you have a bad marriage. Some of you have really bad marriages and you're like, listen, I don't worship my spouse. In fact, I don't like them very much. I would just simply point out, that may be true that you don't, but I bet, because I see it a lot, I bet you stare at them a bunch though. I bet you're eaten up with all their problems and their issues. I bet if you're not careful, because it's easy to do this, you gaze at them more than you gaze at God. Some of you do it because of how in love you are, and others because of how out of love you are. Either way, your gaze needs to be on the giver of the gift, not the gift itself. And so a healthy marriage, since marriage is a gift from God, a healthy marriage then must be centered on God. More on that in the coming weeks. Observation number 2, marriage is designed by God. So it's a gift from God. It's also designed by God. The Lord God said in verse 18, it's not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. And thus we walk into a bit of God's design for marriage. That phrasing there of the woman, Eve, the wife, being made by God specifically to be a helper fit for her husband, causes a lot of people concern and issues, and it really shouldn't. The idea of Eve being Adam's helper, the helper there is an exalted position. It's not inferior. It's not less than, for sure. First, we've already seen that God made man and woman in his image, so they are of equal intrinsic value. Also, you're going to see the Bible call God our helper way more often than you'll see reference to Eve being Adam's helper, though that remains true. But God is not inferior to us because he takes on the role of helper. The role of helper is an exalted position. The idea there of helper, misunderstood though it may be, actually in the original language has the idea of being an equal ally. Or used all over in the Old Testament is the idea of reinforcements. So it's not that Adam's got a pretty good thing going for himself and he needs, he's going to take the hill and accomplish the mission and if Eve comes along and supplements, fine, but if not, it's okay. No, the picture is Adam's not going to make it without his wife. When you step into marriage, that's the design, is that the husband has a role and a call to fulfill, and the wife comes along in a one-flesh union to help the husband accomplish the thing that he's being called to. And the picture there is that of an army being overwhelmed by the opposition, and right at the moment that it was needed, the reinforcements pop the hill and the mission is carried out. That's the exalted, beautiful design behind God in the way in which he brings the woman to Adam as his helper. Now you'll notice that phrasing, I'm sure you have, that she is fit for him. Well, see, he watched all the animals walk by, and none of them were fit for him because none of them were like him. Now, the interesting idea that comes from the language of fit for him, and you see as Adam breaks out into poetic song in verse 23, is that she is fit for him, which means that the woman is like him and not like the animals, yet not like him in that she's not him. She's complementary to him, not complementary like nice hair, complementary with an E, like the two of them together, fit for him. She's like him, but she's not identical to him. Therefore, what you're introduced to in God's design for marriage is tension. Good, godly, biblical, beautiful tension. I don't mean tension like bad tension. I mean tension like if you've ever put up a tent, you know that if it doesn't have any tension, it collapses, and if it has too much tension, it explodes. But the design, God's design for marriage is a complementary tension as husband and wife fulfill the God-ordained, God-designed roles within their marriage. I'm going to say more on this in the coming weeks, but let me say this right now. The solution to the sin of chauvinism is not the sin of radical feminism. The solution to the sin of chauvinism, which is real, men thinking that women are less than, men thinking that women are property, human history has been dominated to a degree by that predominant view. Then the Bible comes along and goes, man, woman, equal image bearers, equal value in the image of God, yet different functions. And it's where our feminist friends don't like the different function idea. That's the problem. But to blur the functional differences between husbands and wives and men and women is simply to drive over into the opposite ditch. And in the way in which marriage works is by going by God's design, not the prevailing cultural design. The prevailing cultural design will put you in this ditch or that ditch, stuck in either one. And God's good design is for us to humble ourselves and in submission say, God, how have you designed marriage to work? Okay, I see it. It's revealed in the Bible. It's not hard. I see it. Okay, I'm going to obey that. Will it be difficult? Of course. Of course. But a husband does not get to say, God, it doesn't matter to me that you call me to love my wife sacrificially and to serve her and to take primary responsibility to lead in the home and in the church. I'm not doing it. Or for the wife to say, God, I know you've called me to submit to my husband and support him in his role, but I'm not going to do it. You do that, you are going counter to God's design. That never ends well, ever. So not only is marriage a gift from God and designed by God, but it is also defined by God. So now, Moses in verse 24, who's writing this, reflects on what he has just seen and written, and now he gives us, by way of a therefore, a definition of marriage, and it goes like this. I'll explain the definition by way of priority, permanence, and pleasure. Marriage is designed by God. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. A word first about priority. A man shall leave his father and mother. You're like, well, Adam didn't have a father and mother. You're right, but you do. And the definition within the design of marriage, now the definition that Moses brings out and that God makes clear is that that previous to marriage, a husband and a wife, a man and a woman, their most important and primary relationship was that of parent to child. Parents, after all, keep their children alive, raise them, feed them, give them wisdom, lead them toward the Lord, all these things. But when a husband marries his wife or a wife her husband, now the primacy or the priority of that previously most important human relationship is eclipsed by a brand new thing. And the brand new thing is now husband and wife now have a primacy and a priority about their relationship that trumps all other relationships. Don't let your kids get in the way of that. Don't let mom get in the way of that. Don't let dad get in the way of that. Don't let friends get in the way of that. Don't let hobbies get in the way of that. Many marriages die because they fail to realize the priority that that human relationship must have. And you think, well, we're married, so we'll just let it go. That's a horrible idea. You don't plant a garden and then just let it go, because when you do that, it's full of weeds. You plant a garden and you till it and you work it and you steward it and you keep it and you prioritize it. And in a marriage is like that. It requires prioritization. It must be that the priority and the primacy of that relationship is protected, even from good distractions like a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 7-year-old or even an 8-year-old. Age of my children, I think. Cute though they may be, especially the baby, she's actually not a baby, we just call her that because we're grieving the fact that she's the last one and it's very cute. But all she wants to do is take her mom away from me. That's it. And I can't let that happen, so I won't. And I will outlast her and win. Because when she's 13, she won't have anything to do with her mom or me, which is no different than how it currently is with me, but at least then I'll get her mother back. But the point is even good distractions, even good ones, cannot usurp, cannot eclipse the priority of God's definition of marriage. Leave father and mother, hold fast to husband or to wife. Second, a word about permanence. Hold fast. Hold fast is not like let's hold hands for a really long time. Hold fast is we're welded together. That's the imagery. We're welded together. The two become one flesh. The two become one, which is why Jesus says what God has joined together, what God has welded together. Don't let anybody tear that apart. This is the language of covenant. Now, covenant is newer, although it's the oldest type, but in our culture, it's newer language. What we tend to think of around marriage because of Disney and romantic comedies and country songs is we think that marriage is all about romantic love and staying in love. That's actually not true. Marriage is actually about covenant. Marriage is about permanence. Marriage is about God welding a husband and a wife together to where two become one, and they ought not be torn apart. Now, of course, the context of the Pharisees asking Jesus in Matthew 19 about divorce specifically is that Jesus, when they asked the question, they're like, basically, can a husband divorce his wife for any reason? And that's what culturally it had become. And Jesus goes, you've got provision for divorce because of hard hearts. Like, that's the reason divorce even exists. You're sinful. And there are two provisions in the Bible by which the covenant of marriage can be shattered. The first is sexual immorality. Matthew 19. The second is Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, abandonment by an unbelieving spouse. We can have that conversation if we need to after the service. I'd be delighted to have it with you and explain that. So there are provisions for the shattering of the covenant, but outside of those two provisions, and even if you have them, it doesn't mean you should go down the divorce road necessarily. It's a conversation more for you and I, or you and one of our other pastors, or one of our counselors here to have. But the whole point is that marriage is meant to be permanent. It's built on covenant, not feelings. And where there is covenant, really beautiful feelings of love can exist. But if there is no covenant, there will never be lasting love at all. And too many marriages are ending because we, quote unquote, fell out of love, or quote unquote, aren't feeling it anymore. And anybody that's been married for a long time and has a healthy marriage knows that the feelings come and go. The covenant must remain. Third, a word about pleasure. The man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. Now, that has more in mind than sex, to be clear. I taught an entire Red Life, I think last year, the year before, on marriage, and I gave a whole session on sex, so you can go listen to that if you would like to. That's on our website, on our app. I also taught in the Portraits of Christ series. I taught a sermon, I think it's called Jesus and the Guilt and Shame of the Garden, where I talked about naked and not ashamed and how that works once sin comes into the world, so you can go listen to that. For now, I simply want to hone in on this reality of God's defining of marriage, that sexual gratification and even emotional gratification, but certainly sexual fulfillment, must come only in marriage and only from your spouse. In other words, there is an exclusivity around the gift of sex that makes it to where sex can only happen, ought to only happen in the confines of covenant marriage and only in that. Meaning that a husband ought to only find his sexual fulfillment from his wife, and a wife only finds sexual fulfillment from her husband. Now, when God brings Eve to Adam, Adam says, "You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen in my whole life." And Eve, because she's a woman, says, "I'm the only woman you've ever seen in your life." And Adam says, "You are correct, but I'll take it." And the point is that's God's design. Now, there's a bunch of women and men that you are not married to. If you're married, you're married to one, and there's a bunch you're not married to. But the original design and definition of marriage still pertains to you, that once you're married, you don't find emotional or sexual fulfillment on a screen, whatever it is, from anyone else. There's an exclusivity now to the covenant of marriage, and each other, become one another's standard of beauty. You become one another's sexual fulfillment. You become one another's emotional bonding and fulfillment. That's how God has defined and designed marriage to work. And God gets to define sex because He designed it for our joy. And if you don't understand that, then what you're going to do is think that God's fences that He has put around sex are killjoys, and they're simply not. Go find me the guy that's addicted to pornography who's full of joy. Go find me the woman or the man who's slept around a bunch and see how fulfilled they are with their joy. The science is coming in on this, and we've known all along because the Bible makes it clear. Sex is like, it's like fire. And fire is really good, and it can also be really dangerous. I heat my house with fire. I have an outdoor wood boiler, so it's outside of the house. I put wood in it. It heats up water, sends it under the ground into my furnace, and my house is warm. I'll keep the fire outside of my house within its confines, really great. Fire inside my house, burning it down, not so great. And sex is the exact same idea. It's good, it's a gift, it's beautiful, it's glorious. God gave it to husbands and wives to enjoy. You get it outside of those confines, it burns the whole thing down. It burns the whole thing down. And so we as the church need to be willing to step into this cultural moment of just so-called sex without consequences. Just have as much as you want with whoever you want. It'll all be awesome. Just do you. It won't be. And we know that. But the church is going to need to step into this. And honestly, I would imagine that the waves of persecution for the church won't come over the deity of Christ or the exclusivity of Christ. It's going to come around what the culture would call an archaic, backwoods, bigoted view of sex. That's where it's going to come. And we need to make sure that when we step into the conversation, we say, God designed it, God defined it, but here's the thing, in that, He's not trying to kill your joy, He's trying to give it to you. God designs it the way He does for joy, for our flourishing. You start doing things different than God designed and defined, and you will never find flourishing, you're just going to find death. Which brings us, of course, to Genesis chapter 3. And in Genesis 3, you may know that Adam and Eve decide that they will no longer find their joy in God, but rather will believe the lie and go around God to find joy. They'll take from the fruit of the tree that God forbade them to eat from. They'll eat of it. Sin will enter into them and into the world and shatter absolutely everything. To which then, of course, you might say, well then, to hell with the idea of marriage, just let it be what it'll be. But no. Because God is profoundly aware of sin coming in and entering into the world, but He is not willing to give up on the gift, the design, or the definition of marriage. No, even in human brokenness and sinfulness, God's good gift, good design, good definition must prevail. Now things have changed, haven't they? Read it, Genesis 3. Of course they've changed. There's implications and ramifications for Adam and Eve's sin, but the call remains the call to honor God, to do this the way He designed it. And of course, sin brings about breaking in relationship, but the breaking, even in the midst of the relationship, must not be viewed outside of hope. Rather, marriage, now in this broken world, must be soaked, saturated, drenched in gospel hope. And of course, you know that in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15, God gives His first glimmer of hope, and He does it again in verse 21. In 15 of Genesis 3, God says, there is going to come one who's going to crush the head of the serpent. I've preached that sermon a bunch of times. Go listen to it. And in verse 21, God made for Adam and Eve garments of skins and clothed them to cover their nakedness and their shame. The point is that even in the midst of brokenness now entering into the world and entering into marriage, there is still gospel hope. And if you are a Christian, do not divorce your marriage from gospel hope. Don't compartmentalize and say, well, there's gospel hope on Sunday morning and there's gospel hope when we sing, but Monday to Saturday, our marriage is just going to be awful and remain that way. It doesn't have to be. Gospel hope must invade your marriage. I'd like to see it happen in two ways. First, rather individually on this, Paul says in Philippians 1 and verse 6, he says, I'm completely certain of this, that He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion at the day of Jesus Christ. Do you know that Paul's certainty that those who have bowed the knee to Jesus will have Jesus finish the work in them He started? Do you know he's saying that right into the middle of broken marriages? Do you know that even in the midst of your marriage being broken because you're broken and all of the issues that may be there, God's plan will prevail? And it may actually even be right now that He means to use the difficulty within your marriage to bring about a work of completion on the day of days that otherwise would not be there. And the point is, even in the midst of the brokenness, God's plan prevails. Second word of hope would be this. You absolutely have to orient the story of your marriage within the storyline of the Bible. Said another way, you have to orient the storyline of your marriage within the storyline of the Bible, which is a story of marriage. Let me explain. The story of the Bible goes something like this. Movement number 1, groom. Bride, garden, no sin, beautiful creation. Movement number 2, because movement number 1 doesn't last very long. Movement number 2, groom, bride, broken by sin, broken creation, no more garden. Now there's a bunch of you in here who have bowed the knee to Jesus and you haven't realized there's 2 more movements to the biblical storyline. So you're sitting here going, well, Alex, I get it was good in the garden. It's bad now. In fact, Alex, it's even worse than you know it to be. Have you seen my husband? I haven't seen your husband, but I've seen the third movement, perfect groom pursuing a broken bride while redeeming all of creation back to himself. Fourth movement, because you're like, well, Alex, what if the guy doesn't get the girl? Fourth movement, a little thing in Revelation 19 called the marriage supper of the Lamb, where our bridegroom Jesus, who has purchased us by His blood, risen from the grave, pursued His bride, the church, even in the midst of her unfaithfulness, and boy is she unfaithful, has destroyed all of her enemies, sits her at a table, clothed in fine linen, and has a meal with her, and then runs about madly in love with her for the rest of eternity in a new heaven and a new earth, better than the Garden of Eden. That's how it ends. So, that means a lot of things. It means at least this. For those of you who are feeling hopeless in your marriage, of which I'm certain there are many, you must orient hope in your marriage flowing out of the headwaters of the gospel. The gospel is true, therefore there's hope for your marriage. God takes dead things and makes them alive. That's what he does. That's what he did when he saved you. Deadness, brokenness is not a problem for God. It's not. And you're sitting there going, this is completely hopeless. Well, of course it's hopeless if it's just you. But if the gospel's true, then let hope rise in your heart that God can step in and do something in your marriage and in you, because he will. But this also means, and I'm nearly done, it also means, if there's this kind of hope, that sitting back and giving up on your marriage is not an option. It's not a biblical option. You say, well, Alex, I'm not getting divorced. Praise God, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who know what the Bible teaches about divorce, so they're not going to because they don't have grounds, but they also look across the landscape of their marriage, dry, barren, cracked, broken, and they say, I'm just going to give it up. And if I got to ride it out for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years till one of us dies, fine, but I'm just giving up. Listen to me. The gospel does not give you permission to mail it in hope that the next 4 decades won't be awful, because they will be awful. And yet your marriage right now in this moment is not beyond healing, and it's not beyond repair. But it's going to be really difficult. You'll notice that the title of this sermon is not 7 or 12 or 15 steps to a better marriage, because there's no such thing as 7 or 12 or 15. But there is such a thing as 2 sinners humbling themselves and coming to meet with a pastor or a counselor who would open the Bible and do the hard work of confronting you in the ways in which you've broken your marriage and contributed to its brokenness, while pressing your face up against the beauty of Jesus Christ. And over weeks and months of counseling and meeting and crying and bleeding and changing, that there can be hope and beauty on the other side. But it's going to be difficult, because you're a sinner and so is he or she. And yet there's profound hope for sinners in the face of Jesus Christ. Husbands, a word to you and we're done. Some of you men are sitting in this room right now and you know, it's like I'm reading your mail, but it's not me, it's the Spirit coming after you. God has set his heavy hand upon you. It's the heavy hand of discipline, and you know that things in your marriage are not right. And you know that when God comes looking for what had gone wrong in the garden, Eve sinned first, God came looking for Adam, because God holds men primarily responsible for the brokenness within their homes. And so you know that that's you. And what you need to decide right now, is you need to decide that it's not going to continue any longer. That your marriage may never improve, but it won't improve for lack of you putting forth the effort to love your wife, to love God, and cultivate a healthy gospel marriage. And so right now, men, brothers, you need to decide and commit right now that when we're done here and we sing in response to the good news of the bridegroom who loves us and is coming for us, that you come down and talk to me or one of our pastors, grab Pastor Ron back there before you get out of here and say, listen, I need some help. And we'll start the process with you, and we'll walk through this thing with you as long as you want to, as long as is required to see gospel beauty come from the ashes of the present condition of your marriage. So, Father, would you do that work of giving hope and healing and restoration, bringing beauty and glory from things that appear, humanly speaking, to have none left. God, would you do the work for your glory? God, would we take seriously the reminder, the call that our marriages are to reflect heavenly realities of Christ pursuing his bride? God, we commit these things to you. I do pray for my brothers in this room right now, my sisters in Christ as well, but particularly for those men in this room that know that it's time. And yet, there's also fear there because they aren't sure if it can be saved and what might come. God, give them courage. Spirit, would you bring conviction? Not only the conviction of sin, but the conviction of hope in Christ and righteousness? And would we see all across this room, anyone under the sound of my voice, would we see a sweeping move of the Spirit for the sake of marriages and gospel and legacy? And the church said,